Clinham Live. Clinham Live. What do I say? Apart from the fact that... what do I say? Don't say it. No, wait. Money can exchange hands. Apart from being much loved colleagues of mine, they also established themselves long before in their own right with the Turing Shroud, which you've been given a copy of, and with their bestseller Templar Revelation. The position they take in this is controversial, to say the least. What would we expect? They deal with something, however, which is very important and which is what they're going to be addressing on today, which is the Templars' interest in John the Baptist and perhaps devotion more closely to John the Baptist, and I'm referring to the ancient order now particularly, and to the Johannite tradition, than to the what we would term conventional Christianity, i.e. the teachings of the Baptist as put forward by Christ later on. I won't go much further than that, because otherwise Lynn will start saying I'm wrong. So, and she's our sort of Obersturmbannführer. So I won't risk the wrath. I will say that their book is on sale outside, and they'll be delighted to sign copies at no extra charge. And I will let them loose on you. I can say nothing else.
Thank you.
Thank you. Could I just make sure everyone can hear okay? People at the back, Steve, yeah, good, well done. Yes, the way I want to approach this is to start by addressing a question that I think probably most of you here will be interested in, which is the modern Templar orders that Stephen was talking about at the beginning. Do they really have any connection with the medieval Knights Templar? And as Stephen said earlier, that their kind of corporate position, if you like, is really maybe, but it doesn't really matter. The modern orders, the various national priories and the international movement, can trace itself back to 1804, when there was an order of the Temple set up in Paris. But it's a question of whether that was founded in 1804 or whether the order was revived in 1804. The founder of the 1804 order claimed that he was actually reviving the medieval order, which had never gone away. It had just been hiding for 500 years, and he had documents to prove it. And the orders that are around today that are connected with NATO and the United Nations trace their descent from that, but they're saying beyond 1804 it doesn't really matter. But despite that line, the Templars' official line today, Lynn and I believe that there is a direct continuation all the way through, from the medieval Templars through to this Order of the Temple that was set up in 1804, and therefore through to today's orders. But the reason we think that is because we came at it from quite an unusual direction. And I'll briefly explain the chain of events that got us there. And surprisingly, it actually started with our research into the Turing Shroud, which led to the first book that we wrote together back in 1994, which you all should have a copy of. And very briefly, I mean, without wanting to give the plot away, but the title pretty much does it, we came to the conclusion that the Turing Shroud is a fake. It was faked by Leonardo da Vinci. But the story is more interesting than it just being a fake. He did it for particular reasons. And looking at his motives, Leonardo's motives, led us to a rather neglected area of the European esoteric traditions, a thing called the Johannite tradition, which is a set of beliefs and ideas that centre on the importance of John the Baptist. And just to quickly deal with a complicating issue that's just far too complicated to go into, you sometimes also get the term Johannite used of traditions and beliefs centred on another St John, which is St John the Evangelist, the disciple of Jesus. But in this talk, when I say Johannite, the John of Johannite in this talk is the Baptist. There is actually a relationship between the two traditions, but it would take hours to explain what that is. Very briefly, our research into Leonardo and the Turing Shroud, when we're looking at Leonardo and his motivations, we found that he had this, what amounts to a kind of fixation on John the Baptist, which is very odd because Leonardo da Vinci was, certainly known to be no lover of the church, no lover of Christianity. He's either thought of as, at best, an atheist, at worst, a heretic. So he's got this thing about a Christian saint, this kind of real obsession that runs through his paintings. When you actually look at it, in a kind of coded way, Leonardo in his paintings, and there are examples of this in the book, is saying that John the Baptist is really important. In fact, he's saying he considers him to be more important than Jesus. And following on from that, again, cutting a long story very short, this led then I to look at various secret societies and esoteric groups that were part of this Johannite tradition and who are around today. And this is what led us to write the Templar Revelation. And all these groups that are around, they claim that they're descended from the Templars, the medieval Templars. They also proclaim themselves to be Johannite. They have this same emphasis on John the Baptist and these suggestions that he's important not just as the forerunner of Jesus, but somehow important in his own right. And sometimes you often get the feeling that they're saying he's actually more important than Jesus. And it's a whole network of related secret societies and groups which form this network. To pick one, because it's a fairly well-known name, it's the Priory of Zion, which became famous in the 1980s in the Holy Blood and the Holy Grail. And the Priory of Zion, for example, says that it was founded during the Crusades. It was founded alongside the Knights Templar, and the two organisations were kind of two wings of the same society. But they say the reason they were both founded is because some of the leaders of the First Crusade, when they were in the Middle East, having captured Jerusalem, encountered what they called the Church of John. And the secrets that they learnt from this Church of John led these Crusader leaders to found both the Priory of Zion and the Knights Templar. And the Knights Templar, again, in the Priory of Zion's documents, the Templars are referred to as the sword bearers of the Church of John. Priory of Zion also present a list of their alleged Grand Masters since the 12th century, which includes all kinds of famous names throughout history, including Leonardo da Vinci, who they say was Grand Master in his day, which is obviously why we started getting interested in this. They have this thing where their Grand Master always takes the title John, so that Leonardo da Vinci was John the 9th, and his successor as Grand Master, they say, became John the 10th. But they actually start, their first Grand Master, who was a French knight back in the Crusades, is listed as John the 2nd. And if you ask the Priory of Zion why, who was John the 1st, they say that, just enigmatically, that the title John the 1st is symbolically reserved for Christ. And which makes you think, well, why should Jesus, assuming when they say Christ they mean Jesus, be honoured by being given the name John? Now this network of societies, the Priory of Zion, as a lot of you probably realise, is really controversial. It claims it's been around for 900 years. Its critics say it was made up in 1956. And very briefly, and it's something we've firmed up on since we wrote Templar Revelation, Lynn and I think actually the Priory of Zion as such was created in 1956. but it was a front for other societies that have a bit of a better pedigree that you can trace back for 200, 250 years. Okay, it's not 900 years, but it's further back than 1956. And they're passing on bits and pieces of these esoteric traditions from these Johannite groups. All of which, all of these societies you can trace back to a system, kind of irregular system of Freemasonry called the Strict Templar Observance, which was founded in the middle of the 1700s. In fact, it called itself Strict Templar Observance later. When it was originally formed, it was called the Brethren of St. John the Baptist. And this was the first Masonic system that explicitly claimed that Freemasonry had its origins amongst fugitive Knights Templar who had fled to Scotland and to keep themselves secret, had formed an underground organisation that became Freemasonry. But the claims of the Strict Templar Observance, particularly the claims of a Templar heritage, were rejected by mainstream Freemasons, eventually even rejected by itself later. But it did survive, and several other sort of esoterically based Masonic systems, the ones that are all connected to the Priory of Zion today, evolved from that and are still around. But of course, this idea that Freemasonry, that there's a link between Templars and Freemasonry that happened in Scotland, is taken a lot more seriously today. There's a lot more historical evidence. For example, Roslin Chapel, where I think most of you are going tomorrow, if you haven't already been, is an important link in that chain between Templars and Masons. And Leonard and I personally are convinced that there is a connection between Freemasonry and the medieval Templars. The interesting thing is that the first people to really make that claim of a link between Templars and Masons wasn't the Masons, it was actually their opponents, their enemies, the Catholic Church. In 1738, the Pope, Clement XII, issued this edict sort of basically condemning Freemasonry on the grounds that it was a continuation of the Knights Templar, which a previous Pope had abolished, and because of the heretical practice of its members. Then if you actually turn to the mainstream Freemasonry, just in the form that we're familiar with today, again you've got this undercurrent of veneration for John the Baptist, alongside John the Evangelist, but it's the two St. Johns are important. And it's been there right from the beginning, from when we first know of Freemasonry. And two things are very clear, that this emphasis on John the Baptist is considered vitally important, but Freemasons have actually no idea why. And you find a lot of Masonic writings amongst their historians and scholars trying to work out this question, why do we have this thing particularly about John the Baptist? The Masonic Oath is sworn to the Holy Saints John. You find a lot of John, sort of Johannite symbolism in Freemasonry. The feast day of John the Baptist, which is the 24th of June, was a very important day to the Freemasons, as it had been to the Templars. Grand Lodge of England, the central authority for Freemasonry in England, was deliberately founded on John the Baptist Day in 1717. So it's there, this emphasis on John the Baptist is there, but it's very clear Freemasons have no idea why that should be. It's just a core part of their traditions. And then when we look at the Order of the Temple that was established in 1804, the one from which the modern Templar organisations are descended, we find the same connections. The same connections with Johannite tradition. And briefly to explain how this order came to be established in 1804, the lead in this was taken by a man named Bernard Raymond Fabre Palaprat, who had been a priest. He'd left the priesthood because he wanted to marry, and then he became a doctor and was a doctor to kind of Parisian high society. And he claimed he had this document, this charter, thing called the Larminius Charter, which gave him the authority to reconstitute the Order of the Temple. Because, according to this story, what had happened is that the last Grand Master of the medieval Templars, Jacques de Molay, before he was executed, had secretly passed on the Grand Mastership to one of the other members who escaped, and that the order had survived ever since. And each successive Grand Master had signed this charter to show the continuity. And then in 1705, there was a meeting in Versailles in which the Duke of Orleans, who was the regent of France then, had used this charter to kind of reinvigorate the order. It took on new members, most of whom were French aristocrats who were virtually wiped out during the French Revolution. And eventually only 4 quite junior members of this order survived, one of them being Fabre Palaprat. And after the dust had settled after the French Revolution, he decided it was time to bring the order back, so he announced it again, and they started taking on new members, and it began to flourish, and it's continued on to this day. The controversy is over this charter is, did it really go back to the last Grand Master of the medieval Templars, or was it, did Fabre Palaprat fake it? No one can be sure. There's no conclusive evidence that this charter is genuine. There's no conclusive evidence that it's fake. So, everyone has to make up their own mind. But Fabre Palaprat did something else. He didn't just revive the Order of the Temple, but he revived it specifically as a Johannite religious, or with Johannite doctrines, because he claimed, based on the documentation that he said came from the medieval Templars, that the medieval Templars had been Johannite. So he set up his order to be a Johannite one, which is... and this nearly kind of destroyed the order before it really took off, because it kind of split the order apart. And eventually he lost the battle, because after he died, the leaders that took over the Order of the Temple totally rejected the Johannite doctrines and decreed that the order at that stage should be only open to Catholics. It's since been changed so it's open to Christians. And the way they looked at it was that although Fabre Palaprat was the real founder of the order and should be applauded for that, this thing about Johannites was a bit of a eccentricity, a bit of a folly of his, that it was all a bit embarrassing and should be forgotten about. And it had nothing to do with the Templars either in today or in 1804 or in the Middle Ages. So summarising what I've just said is that for the last 250 years or so, there have been a few different groups around who've claimed this Templar heritage, or in the case of Freemasonry, have had it claimed for them, although they themselves don't accept it. And in all these cases, we find there's this emphasis on John the Baptist, we find the Johannite tradition, for reasons that those groups either seem to have forgotten or that they just won't tell us. So we've got it with Freemasonry, we've got it with the societies that descended from the strict Templar observance, and we've got it with Fabre Palaprat's Order of the Temple, which very quickly, after he died, got rid of the Johannite elements. So wherever you find claims of Templar descent, you also find John the Baptist. So the question that we really got to ask ourselves was, can we use that to see if there really is a link between modern orders and the medieval order? Because if you could find this emphasis on John the Baptist is so unexpected and inexplicable, and it puzzles you, you don't quite know why it's there. If the medieval Templars also had this thing, if they were part of the Johannite tradition, then that would just be too much of a coincidence and leads you to think there has to be a connection between the fairly recent orders and the medieval order. Fabre Palaprat, as I said, was said based on the records that he had, said the medieval order had been Johannite, but his records are suspect. On the other hand, there's an organisation whose records on the medieval Templars should be more reliable, which is the Vatican, because they suppressed the order and they should know why they were suppressing it, which makes it significant. In the middle of the 19th century, Pope Pius IX actually stated that the Templars had, in his word, been Johannite from the very beginning. And when you actually start to look at it, yes, the medieval Templars did have this veneration for John the Baptist. In the words of the French researcher Michel Lamy, who's written an excellent book on the esoteric side of the Templars, but it's not been translated into English, but he says that, quotes, the Templars rendered a veritable cult to John the Baptist. A lot of their chapels and churches were dedicated to him, particularly in France. But they also seemed to like to hide the fact that they had this veneration for John the Baptist. It was very much the same way that Leonardo did in his paintings. It's like you would put symbols into, the Templars would use symbols that they knew referred to John the Baptist, but that other people around them didn't. It's as if they didn't really want people to know about it. It's a secret thing, which makes you wonder, well, why should it be secret? Because John the Baptist, a saint, there should be nothing dubious about venerating him. But why do they try and hide it behind these symbols? For example, the most obvious symbol is the Lamb of God, the Agnus Dei, which is mostly a symbol of Jesus as Lamb of God, but to various different groups, because it was John the Baptist who said of Jesus, "Behold the Lamb of God," that the Lamb has become a symbol of the Baptist as well. And this is the way that the Templars used it, because you often find that the Lamb of God associated with severed heads, which of course makes you think of John the Baptist because he died by beheading. Interestingly, Leonardo da Vinci also used the Lamb of God in his paintings to represent John the Baptist. There's some pictures in the Shroud book that explain that. The Lamb of God was the seal used by the Templars of the Languedoc, which was kind of their homeland in the south of France. It's where most of their properties were, and most of the kind of interesting stuff they got up to seemed to happen. But also you find the seal of the Grand Master, the Templar Master of England. On one side it's got the Lamb of God, on the other side it has the head of John the Baptist. So, it's just making the point that when the Templars use Lamb of God, it's really their symbol for John the Baptist. In lots of tempered chapels you find disembodied or severed heads. They don't actually identify them, but when you think about it, John the Baptist, the saint that died by beheading. You also think of Baphomet, the idol that the Templars were accused of worshipping when they were suppressed, which is described in various ways, but the vast majority of times it's a head. It's the head of a bearded man. It's a severed head, or the image of a severed head. Some of the Templar Knights who were questioned by the Inquisition actually said it was the head of John the Baptist, and a possible derivation of the name Baphomet, which no one quite knows what it means, but does actually come from the Greek words for baptism. Yuri talked about the link between the Templars and the Holy Grail legends. Most particularly, there's Wolfram von Eschenbach's Parzival, which was written in the early 13th century in Germany, in which, in his version, the knights that guard the Grail are explicitly called Templars. Interestingly, in the 19th century, the esoteric scholar A.E. Waite studied the Grail legends, and he concluded that they embodied the doctrines of what he called a hidden church, that he specifically identified as Johannite. And when you go through the Grail legends, there is, again, a great emphasis on things to do with John the Baptist, severed heads. As you already said, the actual original Grail, the thing that they based the legends on, was originally a severed head on a platter. But then they kind of changed this to become this mysterious thing called a grail, which in the original versions is just a grail. They don't say what it is. Only later it becomes this cup bearing Jesus' blood. As if they're hiding the fact that the object of the quest and the secret you're supposed to uncover is a secret to do with somebody's severed head on a platter. So the medieval Templars, when you look at, they really do have this veneration for John the Baptist. It's hidden, it's unexpected, and then we find this same veneration held by Johannite groups and societies that claim they're descended from the Templars, which makes you think the connection isn't a coincidence, which is why we think this... Well, it leads us to two conclusions. The first is that modern Templar organisations that descended from Fabre Palaprat's order that was created in 1804 really are the direct descendants of the medieval Templars, but ironically that along the way they've either forgotten or rejected the element that was most important to the original Templars, which is the Johannite side of things. But that only really shows us that the medieval Templars, who were founded in the early 12th century, held Johannite beliefs, which were adopted by the groups that came after them, or descended.